The building does not simply stand, it sways. In the dark before dawn, on the 4th floor of an insula in the Subura, a man opens his eyes and feels the whole wooden room shift as a cart rumbles past below. The plank walls are close enough to touch. The air already tastes of smoke, old fish, and the sour breath of too many bodies. A few hundred paces away, up the slope of the Palatine hill, a senator is asleep in a room painted with gardens on a bed of bronze and ivory, and the only sound is water dripping into a marble basin. That distance, a few minutes on foot, was not a gap of income. It was a separate civilization. The city of Rome, around the year 100, held perhaps 1 million people, and the top 1%, the old noble families and their allies, lived inside a world of sunlight and clean water. The other 99%, the plebeians and the enslaved, were packed into warrens where survival itself was a daily calculation. The old language divided citizens into patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the families who claimed descent from Rome's founders. They controlled the Senate, the priesthoods, and the best land. Plebeians were everyone else. But by the imperial period, the real fault line was less about those ancient names and more about wealth, status, and legal rank. The top 1% ate peacocks. The bottom half ate bread, when they ate at all. The Subura was the most notorious of these warrens. It lay in a low valley between the Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal hills, and because it sat below the grand streets, the sun arrived late, and the smoke never left. Apartment blocks called insulae rose 5, 6, even 7 stories high. Their lower floors were stone and brick, but the upper floors were timber and mud brick, thrown up fast by landlords who wanted rent, not safety. Roman rulers knew the insulae were dangerous. Augustus set a height limit of about 70 feet, and later emperors repeated it. Builders ignored it because every extra floor meant more rent. Inspectors were few, bribes were common, and landlords used cheap wood and clay. The result was a city where the higher you lived, the less you were worth. The expression "living under the tiles" meant poverty, and those rooms were the first to burn and the last to be rescued. On the top floor, a family paid the least and risked the most. The beams creaked. The walls were thin. When another tenant dragged a stool across the floor above, dust sifted down. People did not call these buildings homes. They called them traps. Most tenants did not own their rooms. They rented by the month or even by the week, and they could be evicted if they missed a payment. Some people slept in stairwells, under porticos, or in the back rooms of shops. A Roman poet said that Rome was held up by props, but the props were people. The most common killer was not the fall. It was fire. In a one-room flat, there was no proper kitchen. A tenant cooked over a clay brazier or a small charcoal pan. The upper floors were dry timber, and the stairs were wooden ladders or narrow flights that acted like a chimney. Watch what happens when a single lamp tips. The flame catches a wool blanket, then a wooden partition, and then the heat rushes upward, pulling the fire with it. People on the 5th floor wake to a roar below them and realize they cannot go down. Rome burned so often that the Emperor Augustus created a night watch, the vigils, but they were more firefighters than police, and they could not save a narrow Subura alley once a fire took hold. Rich Romans sometimes profited from the flames. The story of Crassus is the darkest example. When a building caught fire, he would arrive with his own enslaved builders and offer to buy the property at a shockingly low price, then put out the fire and keep the land. The people who lived there did not get a share. They lost everything. Not every landlord was a Crassus, but many treated housing as a cold investment. A wealthy man might own 10 insulae, collect rents through an enslaved manager, and never visit a single one. If a wall cracked, the tenants could complain, but they had little power. Most put up with leaks, rats, and rotten floorboards because moving was expensive, and the next room was likely just as bad. If fire was the horror of the night, water was the labor of the morning. A senator's house had pipes, or at least a private well, and sometimes a private bath. A tenant in the Subura had none of that. She walked to a public fountain, waited in a crowd, and carried a heavy jar back up 4 flights. If she lived higher, her legs burned. There was no toilet in the apartment. At night, a chamber pot. In the morning, it had to be emptied, and some people simply opened the shutter and let it fall into the street below. Walk inside a wealthy Roman house, a domus, and the first thing you notice is the light. The roof of the atrium is open to the sky, and a shallow pool in the floor catches the rain. Beyond it lies a colonnaded garden with clipped boxwood, roses, and a fountain. The floors are not wood. They are mosaics, thousands of tiny colored stones shaped into fish, vines, and mythological scenes. In winter, hot air from a furnace moves beneath the floors and through hollow tiles in the walls. This is a private heating system, and only the very rich could afford it. The typical Subura flat had none of that light. It had one window, if it had a window at all, and often the window was just a hole with a wooden shutter. A family slept on mats or a single bed. Their clothes hung from pegs. A pot sat in the corner for waste. The walls were streaked with soot from the brazier, and the smell of onions, sweat, and smoke stayed in the wool. There was no privacy. Children heard every argument, every cough, every illness. A whole family might live in a room about 10 feet by 12 feet, smaller than the pantry in a rich man's kitchen. What did a poor family actually eat? For the very poor, the daily ration became a coarse loaf, often baked in a shared oven or bought at a bakery. Breakfast might be a piece of bread dipped in wine. The main meal, if there was one, was porridge made from barley or emmer, with a little oil or a scrap of salted fish. Meat was rare. The rich, by contrast, could dine on hare, thrush, oysters, and dormice stuffed and roasted. Roman feasts were performances of power, with courses served on silver and slaves to carry every dish. But the same city had children who chewed on bread hard enough to break a tooth. So how did anyone eat? This is where the numbers become brutal. A free adult male citizen might receive a monthly grain dole, about 30 kilograms of wheat, if his name was on the official list. That sounds like a gift from the state, and in a way it was. But wheat is not bread. It still had to be milled and baked, and that took coins. Worse, the dole did not cover women, children, or enslaved people. A man with a wife and 2 children could not live on 30 kilograms of wheat. He needed work, and work was never guaranteed. A day laborer in Rome might earn 1 denarius for a full day of carrying, hauling, or building. A single measure of wheat for the family cost several sesterces, and a denarius was 4 sesterces. Rent for 1 small room could take more than half of everything he made in a month. Add a pair of shoes, lamp oil, a few vegetables, and the math collapses. Most poor Romans did not budget for savings. They budgeted for the next meal. If the free poor lived on the edge, the enslaved lived underneath that edge. Perhaps 1 in 3 people in Rome was enslaved. They could be bought and sold, They could be beaten. They could be freed. But until that moment, they had no legal claim to their own bodies. Some enslaved people worked in a senator's house and might eat well and dress well. Others worked in chain gangs on rural estates or in mines outside Italy, where life was measured in months, not decades. The city itself ran on their hands. They hauled water, cooked, cleaned, taught children, kept accounts, built the roads and temples, and died unseen. Many free poor Romans attached themselves to a wealthy patron. Every morning, clients gathered at a great man's door before sunrise, wearing their best tunics. They greeted him, praised him, and sometimes received a small basket of food or a few coins. This was called the sportula, a handout. It was not charity in the modern sense. It was a transaction. The client gave flattery, votes, and presents. The patron gave just enough to keep him alive and loyal. The system kept the poor close to the rich, but it also reminded them daily who held the power. Here is the part most people get wrong. Rome looked grand because we still see its marble arches and aqueducts, but Roman law was not equal. By the 2nd century, the legal system formally split people into two broad groups: the honestiores, senators, equestrians, veterans, and local councillors received milder punishments. The humiliores, the lower classes, could be beaten, tortured, or sent to the mines for the same crime. A wealthy man found guilty of assault might pay a fine or go into exile. A poor man might be flogged or worse. And if you were enslaved, the law did not even call your suffering punishment. It called it discipline. The question then is whether a person could climb. Sometimes, yes. A slave could be manumitted, freed by a master. As a freedman, he was a Roman citizen with restrictions. He could not hold high office, but he could run a shop, own property, and grow rich. The fictional freedman Trimalchio, in Petronius's satire, throws a vulgar banquet and brags about his wealth. Roman aristocrats laughed at him, but they also recognized him. In real life, freedmen ran bakeries, workshops, and shipping firms. Their sons, born free, could enter local politics, and in rare cases, their grandsons could join the Senate. But for most people, the ladder had no rungs. Even the games, the great entertainment of Rome, reinforced the class system. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 people, and the seating was not random. Senators sat in the front rows, closest to the blood. Equestrians sat behind them. Ordinary citizens filled the upper tiers. Women were pushed to the highest rows. A poor man from the Subura could watch the same emperor, but he watched from a place that told him exactly where he belonged. The free grain and the free shows were not a sign that Rome cared for the poor. They were a safety valve, a way to keep a crowded, hungry city from turning its anger on the palace. At night, the Subura changed. There were no streetlights, only the occasional torch carried by a wealthy man's escort. The alleys were narrow, unlit, and full of strangers. Juvenal, a Roman satirist, wrote that a man who went out to dinner without making a will was reckless. There was no police force in the modern sense. The vigils patrolled for fires and sometimes for thieves, but they could not be on every corner. A poor woman walking home after work had to be alert, and the safest thing was to move quickly and keep close to a wall. The rich walked with a small crowd of clients or enslaved torchbearers. The poor walked alone. The crowding also meant disease. Rome's low districts had bad air, open drains, and mosquitoes. Malaria was common, especially near the Tiber, and in low areas like the Subura, infants died in shocking numbers. A wealthy family could leave for a hillside villa or a country estate in the summer. A poor family stayed in the hot, fetid valley. Wealth could not buy immunity, but it bought cleaner water, better food, more space, and the ability to flee. That was often enough to decide who lived and who died. There was no public hospital in ancient Rome. A rich man called a Greek physician to his bedside. A poor woman relied on family, herbal remedies, or the temple of a healing god. If she was too sick to work, the whole household slid. Because upper floor rooms were cold and damp, chest infections were common. Because the streets were filthy, wounds turned septic. A broken leg could mean the end of a laborer's income. Wealth did not guarantee health, but poverty often guaranteed that a minor illness became a catastrophe. There was one place where the classes briefly shared the same steam. The public baths were one of Rome's greatest gifts, and for a small copper coin almost anyone could enter. The rooms were vast, noisy, and crowded. A poor tenant could not heat water in her upper room, but at the baths she could soak in a warm pool, scrape the dirt from her skin, and sit in a sunlit hall. Even there, status did not vanish. The wealthy arrived with slaves to carry their oil and towels. A senator might have his own private bathing wing and never appear in the public pools at all. But the baths were still a rare break in the brutal rhythm of the city. Class shaped the lives of women just as sharply. An elite woman might spend her day directing slaves, managing a household, and receiving visitors in rooms decorated with frescoes. Her main constraint was legal, not physical. A poor woman worked. She sold vegetables in the market, spun wool, served in a tavern, or did laundry in the cold water of a public fountain. Her children played in the street, because there was nowhere else. By the age of 10, many were already working. A poor girl did not dream of a villa. She dreamed of a day without hunger. A poor boy might become a laborer, a soldier, or, if he was very lucky, a freedman's apprentice. Most stayed exactly where they were born. Consider two women born in the same year, maybe in the same district. One is the daughter of a senator. She will grow up in a domus with a private bath, a tutor for Greek, and a marriage arranged to strengthen a political alliance. The other is the daughter of a day laborer. She will share a single room with 4 siblings. She will not learn to read unless a neighbor teaches her. By the age of 12, she may be working in a cloth shop or a bakery. The first woman will never touch a coin. The second will count every copper. The first will be remembered on a family tomb. The second may not have a marked grave. Education was another wall. A rich child had a Greek tutor, a grammar teacher, and a rhetoric teacher. He learned to speak in public, to argue in court, and to command a room. A poor child learned by watching parents work. Some learned letters at a local school, but school fees and paper were beyond most families. The result was that literacy and eloquence, the keys to advancement, remained concentrated at the top. A poor man could be clever, but if he could not read a contract or speak in the Senate style, the doors stayed closed. One of the cruelest truths of Roman class was that your birth did not simply shape your start. It shaped your body, your speech, your gestures, and the way the law saw you. A patrician child learned to read Greek and Latin from a tutor. A poor child learned to read the street, to avoid the moneylender, and to know which baker would sell day-old bread for less. By the time they were adults, they did not just live in different buildings. They lived in different languages, different rhythms, and different bodies of law. In the face of all this, poor Romans built small communities. They joined collegia or clubs, often centered on a trade, a neighborhood, or a temple. Members paid dues, met for dinners, and contributed to a burial fund. For a tenant in a collapsing insula, a burial club was not a luxury. It was a guarantee that someone would not be thrown into a common pit. These clubs gave the poor a voice, a meal, and a name. The rich had family tombs that lined the roads outside Rome, carved with ranks and achievements. The poor had a shared plot and a communal feast on feast days. With so much hunger and so much marble in the same city, the obvious question is why the poor did not rise up more often. The answer is not that they were content. It is that the system offered small escape valves and harsh consequences. The grain dole fed a fraction of the city. The games distracted. The patron-client system gave a poor man a powerful protector, but it also taught him to bow. And the army and the emperor's guards were always close. A riot in the Subura could be put down with clubs and swords before it reached the Palatine. Most people, exhausted by work and hunger, chose survival over revolt. Yet the rich could not simply ignore the poor. They needed their labor, their rent, their applause, and their obedience. A senator's fortune was often built not on gold mines alone, but on the rent from insulae. The same crumbling apartment block that terrified its tenants produced income for a man who had never climbed its stairs. The poor carried the water, baked the bread, unloaded the grain ships, and filled the arenas. Rome's marble face was lifted by hands that would never be recorded. Here is what the ruins do not show. A Roman apartment block looked tall and dense, but it was also alive with noise, trade, and neighborly friction. The ground floor was often a row of shops. A fuller pounded cloth in urine. A baker's oven made the whole street warm. A barber argued with a customer. A wine cellar set out jars. Upstairs, women lowered baskets from windows to buy bread without climbing down. Children shouted across the light well. It was not silent misery. It was crowded, loud, and human. But that closeness also meant that a fever, a fire, or a collapsed wall could destroy dozens of lives in an hour. Rome's aqueducts brought clean water from miles away, yet the poorest people still had to carry it up 5 flights. Rome's architects could build the Pantheon's dome, yet some apartments were so badly built that they fell down on their own. This is the central tension. The same empire that could move mountains could not or would not give most of its people a safe, dry room. The problem was not ignorance. It was a social order that treated some lives as investments and others as disposable. Rome was a city of extreme contrast in a single glance. From the top of the Palatine, you could see marble temples and red-tiled roofs. From a Subura alley, you saw only the wall opposite your window. The emperor's palace covered a hill. The poor covered the valleys. Both worlds needed each other, but they did not understand each other. A senator might speak of the common good in the forum, then walk past a family sleeping on a step. A poor woman might scrub the floor of a rich house and never see the face of the woman who owned it. In the end, the brutal reality of Roman social classes is not just a story of patricians and plebeians. It is a story about what a civilization chooses to build and what it chooses to tolerate. Rome gave the world law, roads, aqueducts, and stunning art. But it did so on a foundation of unequal risk. The wealthy could sleep in the heated room while, a few streets away, a family counted the cracks in a wooden wall and prayed it would not fall. That contrast is not a footnote to Roman history. It is Roman history.